This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 912 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. I want to be better than I was last week on the Sleeper Show, because I had some bad picks. Justin Fields still hasn't given us that elite fantasy performance this year. Brandon Cooks was overshadowed by Jalen Tolbert. A.D. Mitchell was overshadowed by Alec Pierce. The Miami backfield was a mess outside of Devon Achane. Zamir White ended up getting more receiving work, hurting Alexander Mattison. Jalen McMillan, Tyler Johnson, they didn't do much. It was not a great week, but not everything was terrible. I talked about Quentin Johnston. He had a multi-touchdown day. Wan'Dale Robinson found the end zone too. Daniel Jones was usable. Andre Iosivas scored twice. And yeah, I know I'm talking about bottom of the barrel players, but I want a better hit rate than that. With more data and with more information, I'm expecting that hit rate to be better moving forward. Now, before I get into the sleepers this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. And right now, like I told you yesterday, if you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, you get 3 things. You get a deposit bonus, you get a free pick, and you get a copy of my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are emailed to you after you sign up, and they're updated every Tuesday. All you have to do is head to UnderdogFantasy.com and use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. Once you make a deposit, you'll get those offers. Again, promo code LATEROUND. We'll kick things off as we usually do with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll start with quarterbacks. I'll be honest, I don't love the quarterbacks this week, but we're going to begin with Geno Smith. I do think there's some concern here that the Seahawks just don't have to keep pace with a Tua Tagovailoa-less Miami Dolphins offense. That was pretty hard to say, but I got on my first try. But at the end of the day, we know that Seattle's at least projected to score points. And if they're projected to score points, the quarterback will usually have something to do with that. Seattle is the 12th best implied team total on this week's slate. And while Miami might look okay in fantasy points against, they've been 4th worst in EPA per dropback allowed to start the season. Geno Smith has been a top 10 passer according to that metric. And the nice part about Seattle is that thus far, they've been one of the pass-friendlier teams in the league. They have the 4th highest pass rate over expected so far this season, and they're 9th in neutral script rate. I'm not sure Smith's ceiling is absurd in this game. Like if Derek Carr's out there, I'd much rather play Derek Carr, but I think you could do worse with a quarterback streamer. But maybe you'd rather go with someone like Sam Darnold, as long as Justin Jefferson is active. Darnold and the Vikings rank 3rd in pass rate over expected to start the season, and they get a Houston defense that's been the 3rd best one for quarterbacks thus far in adjusted points allowed. It's still really early, so that number has a ton of volatility, but Houston got Anthony Richardson in week 1, and he was much better against them than he was against the Packers. And then technically, Caleb Williams was a little bit better against them than he was against the Titans. But that Houston-Minnesota game has a healthy 46-point total, and there's a chance that we see Minnesota needing to keep pace with Houston. I don't think it's some ideal matchup. Houston's seen pretty average numbers in terms of neutral script pass rate against, and this game projects to be pretty average from a pace perspective. But there's not a lot going on at quarterback right now. Now moving on to running back, Chuba Hubbard is still under that 50% mark. He works now that Carolina made that switch to Andy Dalton. We may see a bad offense for Carolina still, but they're facing a Vegas rush defense that's allowed 267 rushing yards to running backs in 2 games. Hubbard saw his running back rush share increase by 19 percentage points from week 1 to week 2, and his target share last week was 19%. If that usage continues, he should be fine as a flex player in RB3 play this week. The Buccaneers are one of the biggest favorites on this week's slate because they get the Broncos. A potential positive game script means more potential runs. And that's pretty important for a team like Tampa Bay because they've been the 6th most pass-heavy team over expected this year. Rachaad White is the team's RB1, but like I said earlier this week, he's been pretty rough on the ground. And while he's back at practice, he is dealing with a groin issue. So that makes Bucky Irving a sleeper. He saw 41% of the team's running back rushes last week, so if this ends up being a favorable game script for the Buccaneers, he could hit double-digit touches. Now, people are going to roll their eyes at this next one, but it's Jaleel McLaughlin. It's been a weird season for the Broncos running backs. I thought their target share was going to be higher than where it's at right now. Right now, they're just a little bit above average. And in week 1, we saw Jaleel McLaughlin kind of be the starter or be the main guy in that backfield. And then week 2, Javonte Williams was a workhorse. So it's been a weird season so far for this offense and how they're deploying their backs. The thing is, though, they might go with a run-heavy approach against Tampa Bay. The Bucs are dealing with defensive line issues, and they've been a bottom half team to start the year in yards over expected allowed on the ground, along with EPA per rush allowed. There aren't many waiver wire players getting volume, so McLaughlin might be able to work as a desperation flex. And then the last running back in this tier, I'm going to go over to Justice Hill. The Ravens get the Cowboys this week, and when you've got a good opponent like that, there's always the chance for a negative game script. At the very least, it's a game with a high total. Hill unsurprisingly saw his target share drop from 20% in week 1 to 6.5% in week 2, but his route participation was still 46%. That was a drop by about 8 percentage points, not as drastic. And so far this year, the Cowboys have been 9th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. So Hill kind of works this week, but only in PPR formats. He's kind of in that RB4 range. Now, at wide receiver, Demarcus Robinson is just barely under that 50% mark, so I'll give him a shout. I've got another Rams wide receiver to talk about later, but Robinson is the safest of the bunch. That bunch being without Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. Robinson is the only Rams wide receiver this year to hit an 80% route participation rate in each of their first 2 games. He's turned that into 11 targets and a 15% target share. Now, I don't think he's an absolute smash. The 49ers have struggled against wide receivers in the early parts of the season when adjusting for strength of opponent. But you have to have some concern that the 49ers are going to be able to pressure this Rams offense and how depleted they are. Robinson is more of a, he should be the stable piece in this offense kind of play. But he does have some volatility. He just deserves a shout. And as I said, I have another Rams wide receiver that I'm going to get to later, who I think actually has the better matchup in this game. Next is a pair of wide receivers, and that's Greg Dortch and Michael Wilson. But I will say, I think I'm leaning Greg Dortch this week. I like his matchup better against the Lions because the Lions have struggled a lot against slot receivers to start the year. They face the Rams and the Buccaneers, and they've seen the 5th highest percentage of wide receiver targets against them go to the slot. And according to PFF data, they've allowed the 2nd most receptions and the most total targets to slot receivers. That's Greg Dortchland. He didn't get a lot done in week 2, but the Cardinals didn't have a back and forth game script. He's an 11 personnel guy. And you could go Michael Wilson as well because this Cardinals-Lions game, it projects to be a shootout, or at least a high-scoring one. With Deebo Samuel out, Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle might end up seeing half of San Francisco's targets. But Jawan Jennings is now going to be a full-time player. I'm interested to see how they deploy him because there's some other guys in this offense like Jacob Cowing who belong in the slot, and that's where Jennings usually plays. But there's no doubt that his route participation is going to rise without Deebo Samuel in that lineup. And in an offense that we know can put up points and put up lots of yards, that's intriguing. Now, the last wideout in this tier that I'm going to shout out, it's Jahan Dotson. Now, hear me out. Clearly, I don't feel great about this given how Jahan Dotson performed on Monday Night Football. A.J. Brown was out, and he still saw just a single target. But the good news is that he ran a route on over 85% of Philly's dropbacks. And their game against New Orleans this weekend has a nice 49-point over-under. This is really about getting a player who's part of a high-scoring game who should be running a lot of routes. Those routes might just turn into cardio, who knows? But it's the right environment to get a piece of. I don't think he's a top 50 wide receiver, but I do think he is technically a sleeper. The obvious tight end in this tier is Hunter Henry. He's coming off a game where he saw 50% target share. That's absurd. He now ranks 7th in route participation across the league at tight end. Now, the matchup this week is not great. The Jets so far this season are 2nd best against tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. With that being said, they rank pretty average in adjusted target share allowed to the position. There's not a lot out there at tight end, so the fact that Hunter Henry's getting a lot of run, that's huge. Mike Gesicki saw a 26.5% target share last week. He was productive, but as I talked about in the 10 Trends show, his route participation is still pretty mid. He ranks outside the top 30 at the position in route participation. With that being said, the Bengals may just want to use him more. Maybe that happens this week. But regardless, Cincinnati has a juicy matchup against Washington. This could be the game we see the Bengals finally break out and post a lot of points. So that's why I'm calling out Gesicki. We'll now look at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues who you may be able to start this week. Gardner Minshew is the quarterback that I like most from this group. I mentioned on the 10 Trends episode how the Raiders are shockingly in the top 5 in pass rate over expected to start the season. And Minshew is coming off an honestly impressive performance against the Ravens, despite what the fantasy total might say. The Raiders get the Panthers this week, and Carolina ranks in the bottom 5 in quarterback pressure rate and EPA per dropback allowed. Minshew's in a really good spot. And guess what? We actually have some running backs in this group this week. One of them is D'Onta Foreman. The Browns are facing a pretty mediocre Giants team, and they're currently 6.5-point favorites. Foreman's not that much of a pass catcher. We saw that last week with his 18% route participation. But he's a bruiser. He led all Browns running backs last week with 14 rush attempts, accounting for 64% of their running back rushes. So far this season, the Giants have been third worst in football in rushing yards over expected allowed per attempt. So if this game script goes well for Cleveland, Foreman could benefit. Now, Joe Mixon is trending in the wrong direction this weekend. And at the time of this recording, Dameon Pierce still hasn't practiced this week because he has a hamstring injury that he's dealing with. If both of those guys are out, then Cam Akers is the Texans' lead back this weekend. But it's a situation to monitor because Houston is one of the best offenses in football, and they're sitting with a top 10 implied team total on the slate. If both Pierce and Akers are healthy, it's tough to really go all in, admittedly, especially with Dare Ogunbowale likely taking pass catching work. But Akers could be in store for a good game. Looking at wide receivers, I know that Andrei Iosivas scored twice on Sunday, but he's still rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. He only has a 16% target share on the season, despite T. Higgins being sidelined. But again, Cincinnati gets Washington this weekend. That's the top secondary to target for your wide receivers. And it's basically been that way since last year. Even if T. Higgins plays, Iosivas is going to be the team's primary slot guy. So he works this week. And monitor Jermaine Burton. I said all summer that I think he's the more talented player between himself and Andrei Iosivas. He just needs to get it together between his ears. But his route participation did get up to 20% last week. Baby steps, baby steps. I told you I had another Rams wide receiver to talk about, and that guy is Jordan Whittington. I see Whittington as a more direct replacement to Cooper Kupp. I talked about that earlier this week on the 15 Transaction Show. He should play the slot role in that offense. And if and when he does, he's got a great matchup against the 49ers. So far this year, the Niners have allowed the 6th highest percentage of wide receiver targets to go to the slot, and they've allowed the most yards there. In my opinion, Whittington was just way too cheap off of waivers this week. I think he's like a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 play this week with upside. Jalen Tolbert is still rostered in just 2% of Yahoo leagues, despite an 89% route participation and 22% target share last week. The Cowboys get Baltimore, and it's a game that projects to be relatively high scoring. I talked about that earlier with Justice Hill. But also, both the Cowboys and Ravens so far this year, they've run at a pretty fast pace. They're both top 7 right now in seconds per play. Tolbert could be a cheap way to get a piece of that interesting game. Now, Jordan Addison is still day-to-day with his ankle injury. If he's out again this week, then don't forget to look at Jalen Nailor. Nailor ran a route on every single Minnesota dropback in week 2, and he had a 17% target share. He's primarily played a perimeter role, and that's where the majority of wide receiver targets have gone against Houston this year. They rank first in percentage of targets to the outside. So Nailor could be in store for some production this week, especially if the Vikings hit a negative game script. I don't have any deep tight end plays at the moment, so let's move on to some streaming defenses. Tampa Bay has their injuries, but they should still be fine against Denver as a high floor option. Denver's allowed a top 10 pressure rate. They've got an implied team total just over 16 points, so the Bucs make sense. You could also look at Indianapolis at home against Chicago, given the way the Bears offense has started the season. Vegas gets Andy Dalton, which, yeah, Andy Dalton's an upgrade, but it's still a questionable starter. And then Seattle, they're rostered in 38% of Yahoo leagues, and they get Miami without Tua. So they're a good streamer too. Now, like I've been doing each week, I'm going to use the picks from today's show to put together a quick entry over on Underdog. Last week was rough, but like I said on the show, I wasn't a huge fan of the options for the players that I talked about at the time of the recording. This week, I feel a little bit better. I'm rolling with Gardner Minshew, higher than 218.5 passing yards. I've got him projected closer to 230. We'll also stay in that game and go Chuba Hubbard, higher than 47.5 rushing yards. My projection has him at 54. And then the last one, we're going to boost this entry with a Jordan Whittington touchdown. You guys can feel free to play those over at underdogfantasy.com. Make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. As usual, tomorrow we have the weekly mailbag episode, and then later in the day, you get another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.